The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street as Harold Jenkins carefully adjusted his navy blue veteran's cap in front of his bathroom mirror. At 93 years old, his morning routine had become a sacred ritual. His weathered hands, though marked with age spots and old scars, moved with surprising steadiness as he straightened his collar and brushed off his favorite plaid shirt. A collection of framed photographs on his dresser caught the morning light. Younger versions of himself in military uniform, standing proudly beside aircraft carriers and tanks during World War II. Every Tuesday morning for the past 40 years, Harold would follow the same routine without fail. He would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., take his medicines, shower, get dressed, and head out to his pride and joy, a 1965 Chevrolet Impala that sat in his small but well-kept garage. The car gleamed like it had just rolled off the assembly line, its deep blue paint reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. Harold always spent a few extra minutes just looking at it, remembering all the hours he had spent keeping it in perfect condition. "Another beautiful morning, old friend," he would often whisper to the car, running his hand along its smooth hood before climbing into the driver's seat. The leather interior creaked softly as he settled in, the familiar smell of old leather and polish filling his nostrils. He turned the key, and the engine purred to life with a deep, steady rumble that brought a smile to his face every single time. The drive to Jenny's Corner Cafe took exactly 7 minutes when you caught all the green lights, which Harold usually did. He knew every bump, every turn, and every pothole on the route by heart. The small diner sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, its neon sign flickering slightly in the morning light. The building hadn't changed much since the 1970s, and that's exactly how Harold liked it. As he pulled into his usual parking spot, the third one from the door, always empty because the regulars knew it was Harold's spot, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon already wafted through the air. Through the large windows, he could see Jenny, the owner's daughter, preparing for the morning rush. She had practically grown up watching Harold come in every Tuesday, first as a young girl helping her father bus tables, and now as the manager of the cafe. The bell above the door chimed as Harold stepped inside at exactly 7:15 a.m. "Morning, Harold." Several voices called out in unison. Mary, the elderly waitress who had been working there almost as long as Harold had been coming, already had his usual order written down before he reached his booth. The third one from the window, where the morning light was perfect for reading the newspaper. "Black coffee and blueberry pancakes, Harold?" Mary asked with a warm smile, though she already knew the answer. Harold nodded, settling into the familiar worn leather of the booth. The other regulars, Tom the postman, Sarah from the flower shop, and old Bill who ran the hardware store, all gave him friendly waves or nods. They had all heard Harold's stories dozens of times over the years, but they never tired of them. While waiting for his breakfast, Harold would carefully unfold his morning paper, taking time to read every headline. His mind was still sharp as a tack, and he liked to keep up with world events. Sometimes, younger customers would stop by his booth to ask about his military service, and Harold would share carefully chosen stories from his time in the Pacific Theater. He never talked about the worst parts of the war, instead focusing on tales of camaraderie and the importance of standing up for what's right. The staff and regular customers had come to see Harold as more than just another patron. He was a living piece of history, a connection to a generation that was slowly fading away. His stories of the war years, followed by his life as a skilled mechanic, had become woven into the very fabric of the diner's rich history. Young and old alike would often pause by his booth, drawn in by his gentle demeanor and the wisdom that seemed to radiate from his kind eyes. Little did anyone know that this peaceful Tuesday morning routine was about to be dramatically disrupted, changing how everyone in Millbrook would see their beloved veteran forever. The peaceful atmosphere of Jenny's Corner Cafe shattered at precisely 7:45 a.m. when the thundering roar of motorcycle engines filled the air. The sound grew louder until it seemed to shake the coffee cups on their saucers. Through the large diner windows, Harold and the other customers watched as 8 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming aggressively in the morning sun. The road rebels had arrived in Millbrook 3 weeks ago, and already their reputation had spread through the small town like wildfire. They weren't just any motorcycle club. They were troublemakers who seemed to enjoy making life difficult for peaceful communities. Their black leather jackets, decorated with a snarling wolf's head logo, had become a symbol of intimidation in neighboring towns. Their leader, a towering man known only as Spike, stood well over 6 feet tall with arms thick as tree trunks and a shaved head covered in tribal tattoos. His leather vest was adorned with patches that suggested a less than honorable discharge from the military, something that made Harold's jaw tighten slightly as he observed from his booth. Behind Spike, the other 7 members of the Road Rebels formed an intimidating wall of leather and attitude. The diner fell silent as the bikers entered, the bell above the door chiming almost apologetically. The usual morning chatter died instantly, replaced by the heavy thud of motorcycle boots on the linoleum floor. Even Mary, who had dealt with difficult customers for decades, stood frozen by the counter, coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. Spike's cold eyes scanned the diner until they landed on something through the window. Harold's pristine 1965 Chevrolet Impala. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face as he nudged one of his companions, a shorter man with a wild red beard who went by the name Rusty. "Would you look at that beauty out there?" Spike announced loudly, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone uncomfortable. "They sure don't make them like that anymore." He turned to his gang, speaking loudly enough to ensure everyone in the diner could hear. "Boys, I think we just found ourselves a new toy to play with." The other bikers chuckled menacingly, their eyes now fixed on Harold's car. They didn't immediately notice the elderly man quietly sipping his coffee in the corner booth, his newspaper folded neatly beside his half-eaten blueberry pancakes. Jenny, who had emerged from the kitchen upon hearing the commotion, tried to defuse the situation by approaching the group with menus. "Welcome to Jenny's Corner Cafe, gentlemen," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her obvious nervousness. "Would you like to try our breakfast special?" Spike ignored her completely, instead walking to the window for a closer look at the Impala. "That car's got to be worth a pretty penny to the right collector," he mused aloud, turning to address his gang. "Shame if something were to happen to it, sitting out here all alone." It was at this moment that Spike finally noticed Harold, their eyes meeting in the reflection of the window glass. The biker's expression changed from amusement to something darker as he turned around slowly, taking in the sight of the elderly veteran in his neat plaid shirt and navy blue cap with its World War II insignia. Well, Spike drawled, taking deliberate steps toward Harold's booth. "Looks like we found the owner." The other bikers spread out behind their leader, effectively blocking any escape routes. The tension in the diner rose to an almost unbearable level as the morning sun cast long shadows of the bikers across Harold's table. The old veteran didn't flinch, he didn't look away. Instead, he calmly took another sip of his coffee, his weathered hand steady as he set the cup back down on its saucer. There was something in his calm demeanor that momentarily gave Spike pause, a steadiness that came from having faced far worse situations than a group of bullying bikers. But the moment passed quickly, and Spike's arrogant smile returned as he prepared to have what he thought would be some easy fun at the elderly man's expense. Spike pulled an empty chair from a nearby table, spinning it around and straddling it backwards as he faced Harold. The metal legs scraped loudly against the floor, making several customers wince. The other bikers formed a tight circle around the booth, their leather jackets creaking as they moved. The morning sun that had earlier felt so pleasant now seemed to cast menacing shadows across their faces. "Nice cap you got there, old-timer," Spike said, reaching out to flick the brim of Harold's veteran's cap. "World War II, huh? Must have been something, fighting in the big one." His tone dripped with mockery, and a few of his gang members snickered. "Tell me, Gramps, did you really fight, or did you just peel potatoes in the mess hall?" Harold's hands remained steady as he carefully wiped his mouth with a napkin. His blue eyes, though aged, held a clarity and strength that came from decades of living through both war and peace. He said nothing, which seemed to irritate Spike even more. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man." Spike's voice rose, causing several customers to flinch. "What's wrong? Lost your hearing along with your youth?" Jenny, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern, stepped forward. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was firm. "That's enough. This is a family establishment, and Harold is a respected customer. I'm going to have to ask you all to leave." Rusty, the red-bearded biker, let out a harsh laugh. "Or what, sweetheart? You gonna call the cops? By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. Maybe with a nice classic car as a souvenir." The other customers in the diner sat frozen in their seats, their breakfast forgotten. Mary, the elderly waitress, had retreated behind the counter, her hand hovering near the phone. Tom the postman looked like he wanted to help but didn't know how. Even old Bill from the hardware store, known for his tough talk, seemed at a loss for words. You know what I think? Spike continued, leaning closer to Harold. I think you old-timers had it easy. World War II. That was what, 70-some years ago. Bet you can't even remember what you had for breakfast yesterday, let alone what you did in the war. Throughout all of this, Harold maintained his composure. He methodically folded his newspaper, placed it beside his empty coffee cup, and straightened his silverware. His movements were precise, deliberate, and completely unhurried. This seeming indifference to their intimidation tactics only served to fuel the bikers' frustration. Maybe we should take that car of yours for a spin, Spike suggested, his voice turning dangerous. Teach you a lesson about respect. What do you think, boys? The other bikers voiced their agreement with cruel laughter and taunting remarks. Jenny made one more attempt to intervene. I've already called the police, she lied, hoping to defuse the situation. They'll be here any minute. Nice try, honey, Spike sneered, not even bothering to look at her. But we both know the local cops are having their morning meeting at the station right now. Nobody's coming to help Grandpa here. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point. The air felt thick and heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Some of the other customers had quietly slipped out, while others remained frozen in place, unwilling to leave Harold alone but unsure how to help. Through it all, Harold's expression never changed. His eyes, which had seen the horrors of war and the beauty of peace, remained calm and focused. There was something in that steady gaze that began to make some of the younger bikers shift uncomfortably, though they tried to hide it. They had expected fear, or anger, or pleading, but this quiet confidence was something they didn't know how to handle. What none of them realized was that Harold's apparent calmness wasn't born of fear or resignation. It was the tranquility of a man who had faced far worse situations and lived to tell about them. As he sat there, surrounded by leather-clad bullies, his mind was already working through scenarios and possibilities, drawing on decades of experience that his tormentors couldn't begin to imagine. Spike's patience was wearing thin. The old man's continued silence and calm demeanor had begun to chip away at his usual confidence. Standing up suddenly, he slammed both hands on Harold's table, causing the coffee cup to rattle in its saucer. All right, old-timer, playtime's over, Spike growled, reaching into his leather jacket and pulling out a switchblade. He didn't open it, but the threat was clear as he placed it on the table. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to hand over the keys to that pretty Impala outside, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you keep that fancy veteran's cap as a souvenir. The diner had grown so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the ceiling fans above. Mary had finally gathered the courage to reach for the phone behind the counter, but Rusty noticed and shook his head menacingly, causing her to freeze in place. Harold slowly reached up and adjusted his cap, a gesture that seemed almost casual if not for the gravity of the situation. For the first time since the bikers had entered the diner, he spoke, his voice steady and clear despite his age. Young man, Harold said quietly, looking directly into Spike's eyes, I've seen bullies before. In fact, I've seen them in places a lot scarier than Jenny's Corner Cafe. He paused, taking a slow breath. Back in 1944, I watched bullies march across Europe, thinking they could take whatever they wanted. They learned differently. Spike's face reddened with anger. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Usually, people, especially elderly people, would be begging for mercy by now. Listen here, you senile old fool, he snarled. This isn't 1944, and I'm not some Nazi you can lecture about morality. This is simple. Hand over those keys, or things are going to get real unpleasant. The other bikers shifted their positions, trying to look more threatening. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the diner. Harold's words had struck a chord, and even some of the younger gang members exchanged uncertain glances. You know what the difference is between you and those bullies I met in the war? Harold continued, his voice taking on an edge of steel that no one in the diner had ever heard before. They at least had the courage to wear uniforms and face their enemies openly. You hide behind leather jackets and switchblades, picking on people you think can't fight back. Spike's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. Last chance, old man. The keys. Now. He picked up the switchblade, letting the morning light glint off its surface. Harold slowly reached into his pocket. The bikers tensed, expecting him to pull out his car keys. Instead, he withdrew a small, worn photograph and placed it on the table. The image showed a much younger Harold standing next to his Impala, wearing racing gear. "That car outside," Harold said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made even Spike pause. "I've had her for over 50 years. Bought her new in '65, the same year I won the Northeast Amateur Racing Championship. Been maintaining and improving her ever since." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Spike's face. This wasn't the doddering old man he had expected to intimidate. There was something in Harold's eyes, a quiet confidence born of experience, that suggested this situation might not play out as planned. Harold began to stand up, his movements deliberate and controlled. Despite his age, he drew himself up to his full height, and though he was shorter than Spike, there was a dignity and presence about him that commanded attention. "So here's my counter-offer," Harold said, picking up his car keys from the table. "You and your friends are going to leave this diner, get on your bikes, and ride away. Because if you don't—" He let the sentence hang in the air, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had faced far worse threats and emerged victorious. What the road rebels didn't know, what nobody in the diner except Harold knew, was that the seemingly ordinary 1965 Chevrolet Impala parked outside was far from standard. As Harold stood facing down the bikers, his mind traveled back through the decades of work he put into his beloved car. Long before he became known as the quiet veteran who enjoyed his Tuesday morning pancakes, Harold Jenkins had been something of a legend in the underground racing scene of the 1960s. His skill behind the wheel was matched only by his expertise as a mechanic. After returning from the war, he had channeled his engineering knowledge from maintaining military aircraft into understanding every aspect of automotive performance. The Impala's engine wasn't the original 396 cubic inch V8 that came from the factory. Hidden under the stock-looking exterior was a carefully built and tuned 427 racing engine, the same type that had powered the fastest Chevrolets of the era. Harold had spent countless weekends modifying it, adding fuel injection when most cars still used carburetors, upgrading the suspension with components that wouldn't be common on street cars for decades to come. The car's brakes were now modern discs at all four corners, cleverly hidden behind period-correct wheel covers. The transmission was a heavy-duty 5-speed manual instead of the original automatic, with a shifter that looked stock but operated with race car precision. The suspension had been completely rebuilt with advanced components that Harold had carefully disguised to maintain the car's original appearance. As he stood in the diner, Harold remembered the long nights spent in his garage, perfecting every detail. He thought about the dozens of trophies gathering dust in his basement, won at tracks across the Northeast before he decided to retire from racing. His hands, though aged, could still feel the exact way the engine should sound by touch, could still make adjustments that mechanics half his age wouldn't understand. Jenny's father, Old Joe, had been the only person who'd ever come close to discovering Harold's secret. Years ago, he'd commented on how the Impala seemed to sit slightly lower than other cars of its vintage, and how the engine sound wasn't quite stock. Harold had simply smiled and changed the subject. He'd always believed that some secrets were best kept quiet until they were needed. The modifications hadn't stopped as technology advanced. Harold had kept up with the times, adding modern engine management systems carefully hidden within the classic dashboard. The fuel tank had been replaced with a safety cell designed for race cars. Even the seats, which looked original, had been subtly reinforced with modern racing materials. Every winter, when the roads were empty and covered in salt, Harold would spend hours in his heated garage, updating and maintaining his car. The other residents of Millbrook assumed he was just a meticulous old man keeping his classic car in show condition. They had no idea that beneath the pristine paint and chrome lay a vehicle capable of outperforming most modern sports cars. The bikers, with their loud motorcycles and aggressive attitudes, had made a critical mistake in judging Harold's car by its appearance. They saw an old man's preserved classic, worth stealing for its collector value. They didn't see the carefully concealed dual brake systems, the reinforced frame, or the high-performance tires that looked vintage but were anything but. Even now, as the tension in the diner reached its peak, Harold could picture every modification, every upgrade, every carefully disguised enhancement he'd made over the years. He knew exactly what his Impala could do, had tested its capabilities on empty back roads late at night when nobody was watching, The car wasn't just transportation, it was a precision instrument, as finely tuned as any machine he worked on during the war. Harold's eyes drifted to the window where he could see his car's reflection in the morning sun. To anyone else, it looked like a perfectly preserved piece of American automotive history, but he knew better. And soon, so would Spike and his gang of troublemakers. Harold's movements were unhurried as he placed a $20 bill on the table to cover his breakfast. With deliberate calm, he picked up his car keys, letting them jingle softly in his weathered hands. The morning sun streaming through the diner's windows caught the chrome Chevrolet key fob, making it glint like a small star. "Well, boys," Harold said quietly, "shall we take this outside?" Spike's face split into a cruel grin, thinking the old man was finally giving in to their demands. He gestured to his gang, and they formed a tight circle around Harold as he walked toward the diner's door. Jenny watched with worried eyes, while Mary clutched her order pad so tightly her knuckles turned white. The group emerged into the warm morning air, the bell above the door chiming one last time. Harold's Impala sat exactly where he had parked it, its deep blue paint gleaming in the sunlight. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a perfectly preserved classic car. "Smart choice, old-timer," Spike sneered, holding out his hand for the keys. "Now hand them over, and we'll let you walk home." Harold looked at his car, then at the gang of bikers surrounding him. His next movements happened so quickly that later, when the witnesses tried to describe it, they couldn't agree on the exact sequence of events. In one fluid motion that belied his age, Harold spun away from Spike's outstretched hand and covered the distance to his car in 3 long strides. Before any of the bikers could react, he had the door open and was sliding behind the wheel. The key found the ignition as naturally as a bullet finds its chamber. "Hey!" Spike shouted, his voice mixing with the sudden roar of the Impala's engine. The sound that emerged from under the hood was nothing like what anyone expected from a classic car. It was deep, aggressive, and powerful, the sound of a finely tuned racing engine awakening. The bikers rushed toward the car, but Harold had already depressed the clutch and engaged first gear. The Impala's tires chirped against the pavement as he pulled away from the curb with precision timing. Spike lunged for the trunk but caught nothing but air. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Instead of fleeing straight ahead as the bikers expected, Harold executed a perfect J-turn in the middle of Main Street. The Impala pivoted gracefully on its axis, the morning sun flashing across its chrome trim like lightning. The move was so smooth, so professionally executed, that several onlookers who had gathered at the diner windows actually applauded. The bikers stood frozen for a moment, their faces showing a mixture of shock and disbelief. They had expected an old man's desperate escape attempt. What they got instead was a display of driving skill that belonged more on a professional racing circuit than a small town street. "What are you idiots waiting for?" Spike bellowed, already running toward his motorcycle. "Get after him." But Harold had used those precious seconds of their surprise to his advantage. By the time the first biker reached his motorcycle, the Impala was already halfway down Main Street, its engine note singing a song that no stock 1965 Chevrolet had ever sung before. Through the rear-view mirror, Harold could see the bikers scrambling to mount their motorcycles. A small smile played across his lips as he smoothly shifted into third gear. The hidden tachometer, mounted discreetly below the dash, showed the engine was just warming up to its task. Inside the diner, the customers had rushed to the windows to watch. Jenny stood with her hand over her mouth, while Tom the postman was already pulling out his phone to record what was happening. Even Mary had abandoned her coffee pot to watch the scene unfold. Did anyone know he could drive like that? Someone whispered in awe. The sound of multiple motorcycle engines roaring to life filled the air as the road rebels began their pursuit. But Harold remained calm, his hands resting easily on the wheel in the same position he'd used during countless races decades ago. He knew every back road, every shortcut, and every hidden turn in the county. More importantly, he knew exactly what his carefully modified Impala could do. The chase was on, but it wasn't going to go the way the road rebels expected. Not at all. The morning sun cast long shadows as Harold's Impala glided smoothly onto Cedar Street, its engine purring with barely contained power. In his rearview mirror, he could see 8 motorcycles racing to catch up, their riders hunched forward with determination. Spike led the pack, his face twisted with anger at being outmaneuvered by the old man. Harold smiled slightly as he approached the first major decision point in his escape route. To his left was the main highway, the obvious escape route that the bikers would expect him to take. To his right was Old Mill Road, a winding path that led into the hills above town. The bikers were gaining ground, their lighter and more powerful motorcycles eating up the distance. At the last possible moment, Harold downshifted and turned right onto Old Mill Road. The Impala's modified suspension kept the heavy car perfectly level through the turn, while its hidden racing tires gripped the pavement with surprising force. Behind him, two of the bikers who had been going too fast nearly missed the turn, their motorcycles wobbling as they struggled to change direction. "Let's see how well you boys know these roads," Harold muttered to himself, his hands moving with practiced ease across the controls. He had driven these routes thousands of times over the decades, often in the early morning hours when he was testing his latest modifications to the car. Every curve, every dip, and every bump was mapped in his memory like an old friend. The road began to climb into the hills, its surface becoming rougher and the turns growing tighter. This was where Harold's experience and his car's sophisticated suspension gave him an advantage. While the bikers had to slow down for the bumps and potholes, the Impala soaked them up without losing speed. Spike and his gang were growing frustrated. What should have been an easy chase was turning into an embarrassing pursuit. Their high-powered motorcycles had the advantage of power and agility, but they couldn't use it effectively on the unfamiliar road. Every time they thought they were gaining on the Impala, Harold would take a turn just a little faster than they dared, or brake a little later going into a curve. The chase led them past Old Thompson's farm, where Harold had helped repair tractors in exchange for using the long private road for testing his car. As they passed the farm's entrance, Harold gave a quick horn tap, a secret signal. Old Thompson, who had been watching for just such a moment, pulled his tractor out onto the road behind the Impala but before the bikers, forcing them to slow down and weave around the farm equipment. "You crafty old devil," Spike yelled in frustration as he maneuvered around the tractor, losing precious seconds in the pursuit. By the time the gang cleared this obstacle, the Impala was disappearing around the next bend. Harold knew he was approaching his final gambit. Up ahead was Logger's Loop, a series of 3 hairpin turns that locals approached with caution even on the best days. But Harold had practiced these turns hundreds of times, and his car was perfectly set up for them. The Impala's brake lights flashed briefly as Harold set up for the first turn. The bikers, sensing an opportunity, pushed their motorcycles harder. But Harold wasn't slowing down as much as they thought. Instead, he was shifting his car's weight, setting up for a complex sequence of moves that would use all of his racing experience. What followed was a masterclass in precision driving. The Impala danced through the hairpins, its tires singing but never screaming, the chassis balanced perfectly between grip and slip. Harold's movements were smooth and precise, each gear change and steering input timed to perfection. The bikers, trying to keep up, found themselves struggling. One by one, they had to slow down or risk sliding off the road. Even Spike, the most skilled rider among them, couldn't match the old man's pace through the technical section. By the time Harold emerged from the final turn, the gap had grown significantly. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the frustrated bikers falling further behind, their bravado replaced by the realization that they had severely underestimated both the car and its elderly driver. As the road straightened out again, Harold allowed himself a small chuckle. The chase wasn't over yet, but he had made his point. The next phase of his plan was about to begin, and the road rebels were about to learn an even more valuable lesson about respecting their elders. The story of Harold Jenkins's wild chase through Millbrook spread faster than a summer wildfire. By the time he pulled his Impala back into his usual parking spot at Jenny's Corner Cafe the following Tuesday morning, the tale had grown into local legend. The diner was unusually crowded that day, filled with people hoping to catch a glimpse of the elderly veteran who had outsmarted the notorious road rebels. Harold stepped out of his car, adjusting his navy blue veteran's cap with the same calm dignity he always showed. The only difference was the knowing smile that played at the corners of his mouth as he walked toward the diner's entrance. The bell chimed above the door, and this time, instead of the usual quiet greetings, he was met with a standing ovation. Jenny rushed forward to hug him, tears of relief in her eyes. "We were so worried about you after you disappeared around that last bend," she said, leading him to his usual booth. "But then we heard what happened up at Miller's Crossing." Word had gotten around about how Harold had led the bikers on a wild chase that ended at the old Miller's Crossing bridge, where the local police had been waiting. It turned out that Harold had used his car's hidden police band radio, another modification from his racing days, to coordinate with law enforcement during the chase. By the time the road rebels realized they had been led into a trap, it was too late. "Your breakfast is on the house today," Mary declared, already bringing him his usual black coffee and blueberry pancakes. "Actually, your breakfast is on the house forever, if you ask me." The diner's regular customers gathered around Harold's booth, eager to hear the story firsthand. Tom the postman had actually captured part of the initial escape on his phone, and the video had gone viral on local social media. Old Bill from the hardware store couldn't stop shaking his head in amazement. "I'd known you for 20 years, Harold," Bill said, "and I never would have guessed you were some kind of professional driver. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Harold took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Some skills," he said with a gentle smile, "are best kept quiet until they're needed. Like in the war, you never show your full hand until the right moment." The local newspaper had run a story about the incident, discovering Harold's racing history in the process. Photos of his younger days, standing proudly next to his Impala at various racetracks, now decorated the diner's walls alongside his military service pictures. The article had even tracked down some of his old racing trophies, bringing to light a chapter of his life that most people in town had never known about. The road rebels, it turned out, were wanted in 3 states for similar intimidation tactics. Their arrest at Miller's Crossing had led to multiple charges, and Spike's fake military patches had earned him extra attention from the authorities. The gang's reputation was shattered, not just by their arrest, but by the fact that they had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by a 93-year-old man in a classic car. As the weeks passed, Harold's Tuesday morning routine returned to normal, but with some notable changes. Young car enthusiasts would often stop by the diner, hoping to learn from his experience. He began teaching a free basic auto mechanics class at the local community center, passing on his knowledge to a new generation. The local police department even asked him to give a defensive driving seminar to their officers. His Impala remained parked in its usual spot, still looking like nothing more than a perfectly preserved classic car. But now, people would look at it differently, wondering about the secrets hidden beneath its pristine exterior. Sometimes, early in the morning, locals would report hearing the distinctive sound of its engine on the back roads, as Harold kept his skills sharp. The incident had changed something else in Millbrook, too. The town's elderly residents were viewed with new respect, as people were reminded that age didn't diminish the spirit of those who had lived life to the fullest. Harold's example showed that sometimes the quietest people had the most remarkable stories to tell. Every Tuesday morning, Harold would still arrive at exactly 7:15 a.m., order his usual breakfast, and read his newspaper. But now, whenever young troublemakers passed through town and saw the pristine blue Impala parked outside Jenny's Corner Cafe, they kept their distance. After all, you never knew when a quiet elderly veteran might turn out to be more than they appeared to be.